Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. And for today's episode, we're going to go back and rank the studio albums by the American Spud Boys themselves, Devo. Devo are a band that throughout the course of their 50-year career have continually preached the gospel of de-evolution. If you yourself are somebody that is skeptical regarding the reality of de-evolution, I would suggest that you take a closer look at your surroundings. Devo are a highly influential band that have the distinction of being pioneers in many musical subcategories, including art rock, proto-punk, punk rock, post-punk, new wave, electronica, and industrial, just to name a few. In fact, if you were to go back and really think of any modern music subcategory, it is a good chance that Devo has their tentacles wrapped around it in one form or another. In my opinion, Devo are not only one of the most important bands of all time, they are simply one of the best. This is a band that's integrity is beyond reproach. This is a band that has never compromised themselves or their musical vision, and despite their sort of outsider status, a band that defied logic during the 1980s and somehow weaseled their way into the musical mainstream. As far as my personal relationship with Devo goes, I really don't remember a time when I wasn't super familiar with it, at least who the band Devo was. I was fortunate enough as a young kid in the sense that I got MTV in my house at a relatively young age. And back during the mid and early 1980s, Devo were always on MTV. In fact, that was one of the bands that I most associated with MTV back in its early days. But as far as any sort of physically formatted music, my first relationship with Devo goes back to a cassette tape, which I've talked about on this channel several times in the past. It is a cassette tape that my mother had in her car, and looking back on it, it's a little bit ironic in a sense that my mother had this cassette, because this was definitely not the type of music that I associated with my parents, but it was this compilation cassette called Summer Fun Volume 2, which came out in 1982, I believe. This compilation cassette featured artists such as Tony Basil, Flock of Seagulls, Billy Idol, OXO, Rick Springfield, and of course it also featured the song Whip It by Devo. And this was a cassette tape that, despite the fact that this wasn't really my mother's taste in music, this was a cassette tape that she absolutely wore out. I knew every song on this cassette tape by heart. So I remember that being the first time in my life that I ever saw anything physically that had Devo as a part of it. As far as my fandom goes, I started collecting Devo albums back in 1994, not long after I got out of high school. And I would say that I started off as somewhat of a casual fan, that is, until I saw the band live for the first time in 1996, at which point I became a loyal, slobbering, over-the-top fanboy, and to this day I remain a loyal foot soldier in the Spud Army. This is not only one of the greatest bands that I've ever seen live, but also one of the funnest, and a band that if you do have an opportunity to see live at some point in time now, 50 years into their career, I know that Devo just did a run out over the past year celebrating the 50th year anniversary. I know they came out here to Nashville and played the Ryman Auditorium. This is one of the greatest live bands I've ever seen. This is a band that I've had the opportunity to see live several times over the years, and every single time I've ever seen them, it ranks as some of the greatest shows I've ever seen. It was seeing them live in 1996 that really sort of catapulted me in to the sort of super fan status that I basically claim today. But as far as this ranking is concerned, there are 11 albums on this ranking. Now, you may be asking yourself, hey, there's only 9 albums in the Devo catalog, so how can you have 11 albums, Jim? You're as dumb as you are ugly. Well, as hurtful as that is an excellent question, and I'm glad that you brought it up. For the sake of this ranking, there are 11 albums because I did include 2 sort of compilations. Now, I've done this in the past on this channel when I rank these catalogs by these artists that I love. Every once in a while, I will toss in a compilation or 2, and the reason why I toss in these compilations is because these are compilations that, to me, feel like albums. And when we get to the compilations in the Devo catalog, I will explain them as we go along. It will not take very long to get to the first one, I can assure you. But there are 11 albums on this ranking list, which is sort of misleading in a way. To go back and rank the studio albums by Devo isn't really telling of the band's entire story, because throughout the course of their 50 years, this band has only released 9 official studio albums, which, if you think about it, really only makes up about 50% of the band's catalog. This band has put out so much music that wasn't necessarily, included on albums, that it's really sort of difficult to go back and get a sense of the band's entire catalog just by ranking its studio albums. But that is what we are going to attempt to do here today. Like I said, there are 11 albums on my ranking. As always, feel free to join the conversation in the comment section below. Let me know where I got it right, where I got it wrong, and where you would rank these 11 albums within the Devo catalog. To me, this was actually somewhat difficult. Not towards the back end of the ranking. A lot of the stuff that sort of came in towards the tail end, to me, is relatively obvious. It's something that I sort of knew where these albums were going to drop. But especially when you get into the classic era of the band's studio albums, this was remarkably difficult. This was something that I really actually kind of labored over. And some of these albums, especially the albums that I listened to a lot less in the band's catalog, I've gone back and been listening to over the course of this week. And man, some of these records, I got to tell you, I have not listened to in many, many years. And for a couple of them, for pretty good reason, I would make the argument. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get into this ranking list. Like I said, there are 11 albums, 9 studio albums, and 2 albums that are technically compilations. Like I said, you may or may not include these compilation albums in your rankings, but for the sake of today's conversation, I have. If nothing else, it just helps sort of stretch the Kool-Aid a little bit. So just bear with me, and let's have a good time with this thing, if you don't mind. Are you having a good time? Is this fun for you? I severely doubt it, son. Anyway, coming in at number 11, this album was released on July 23rd, 2013. This is the first of the 2 compilations that I included on this ranking list, and this is the album Something Else for Everybody. Of course, this is the companion piece to the band's 2010 studio album, Something for Everybody. This is a compilation album which features outtakes and, as they call it, focus group rejects from the Something for Everybody recording sessions. And when this album first came out, I was extremely excited about it because I was a big fan. Especially during this time, I was a big fan of the Something for Everybody album. So I was extremely curious to hear what some of these outtakes and social group reject songs would sound like. I really liked the sound that the band had on the Something for Everybody album, and I was hoping that these songs would be maybe not quite as good as the material that was on Something for Everybody, but, close. The thing that I enjoy about bands when they release these sort of special edition releases, or these albums that are made up mostly of outtakes and rejects, is I'm not necessarily hoping that these are singles or alpha tracks, but my expectations are somewhat modest, generally speaking. That being that I hope that these are just songs that are sort of passable B-sides. I think that is a reasonable expectation for these compilation albums that come out. And for the most part, honestly, this one sort of falls flat. You definitely get the sense as to why most of this material was left off of the Something for Everybody album. An album, Something for Everybody, that I still like a fair amount. This one does have a couple of good songs on it. I really like the song Monster Man. On the Inside is okay. Think Fast is good. I Love Your Gun is pretty good. But for the most part, most of this material to me sort of falls flat. It is generally sort of forgettable. Like I said before, you definitely understand why a lot of this material was sort of left off of the Something for Everybody album. But if you're a big Devo fan like I am a die-hard, loyal devotee. These songs are fun to have in the library. Now, this is one of those records I was just talking about a second ago. I have probably not listened to this album up until this week in probably 2 or 3 years, because every time I listen to it, I want to like it. I want to love it. But every time I listen to it, some of it's kind of a struggle to get through, honestly. So for me, it's my number 11. Like I said, you may or may not consider this one an album. You may or may not include that one on your ranking list, but for the sake of this one today, it is number 11. Number 10. Now, you can't argue that this one's a studio album, son. You can't make that argument. Something Else for Everybody, I understand. This one is a studio album. You can't argue that. And this one came out in June of 1990. It was produced by the band themselves, and that is their album Smooth Noodle Maps. Now, I remember when I first bought this album, I bought this album not too long after I bought the album that preceded this one, Total Devo. And Total Devo is an album that I like. It's definitely not the band at the height of their snugness, but it is an album that I like. But I remember when I bought Smooth Noodle Maps, this is a record that I just wanted to be better than Total Devo, because I felt as if Total Devo was not the band firing on all cylinders. And unfortunately, this album, to me, is a little bit less than Total Devo. This is a record that, as I just mentioned before, was Something Else for Everybody. Up until this past week, this is a record that I probably have not listened to in probably like 5 years, honestly. This is a record that, again, every time I listen to this record, I want to like it because I am such a huge fan, and I don't dislike it. This is not a terrible album. The only album that they've ever put out that I would even say is not terrible. I mean, Devo's not capable of being terrible. You understand? They're just too good. But the only album, if you consider this one an album, this is the only album that to me is pretty bad most of the way through. I mean, like I said, there's a few good songs on this one. This album is not terrible. It's not the worst thing I've ever heard. It's just very bland, and when you have a band like Devo that are as brilliant and amazing as they are at their peak, they sort of end up working against themselves in a way when it comes to the albums in their catalog. And this album it's bland, it's boring, it doesn't really do anything. This was the second album which featured David Kendrick on drums, which, that was a really, tall feat for David Kendrick to come in and replace Alan Myers on drums to begin with. I don't necessarily love the artwork. I didn't really like the band's aesthetic when it came to this era. Of course, that is a big thing with Devo. With every album, not only does the band change sonically, but they change aesthetically, and I didn't particularly love the band's aesthetic during this period of time either. As far as the songs on this record, there's some stuff on here I like. I like Spin the Wheel. I like Postmodern Man. A Change Is Gonna Come is okay. I love the song Pink Jazz Trancers. That is actually one of my favorite songs on the record. But if I had to pick a favorite song off Smooth Noodle Maps, to me that's Easy, and that's Morning Dew. So for me, like I said, this is a record I have not listened to in many years. Not planning on going back and listening to it immediately. I have a sense that this record is going to go back on the bench, where it spends most of its life, at least at this point in time. So for me, Smooth Noodle Maps from 1990 is number 10. Number 9. Now, these next two were really close. I mean, this is virtually a tie. This was actually one of the decisions on this ranking list that sort of kept me up at night. Give it. The first two, Something Else for Everybody and Smooth Noodle Maps, that was easy. Those are easy. The next two were difficult, just in relation to each other. But for number 9, I'm going to go with an album that came out on June 15, 2010, produced by Devo and John Hill. And that is the band's most current album, Something for Everybody. Now, this album came out in 2010, so you use the term most recent. You're using that term extremely loosely. This album, it's hard to believe that this album has been out for 14 years. I realize that that is the most cliche thing you could ever say, but it doesn't make it any less true. You understand? But this is an album, Something for Everybody. I remember when it first came out, I was beyond excited when this record came out. It had been 20 years since the band had released a full-length studio album. I remember the day that this record came out, I was on my way to work in the morning. I stopped by my local record store on my way to work just to pick up a copy of this album on CD at the time. I had it in my backpack all day at work, and that was honestly one of the longest days of work I've ever had to get through, because I knew that I had this record and probably a sixer of Red Stripe waiting for me at home. And I remember every little bit of downtime I had during that day, I would run back to my backpack, I would open up my bag, and I would check out the album on CD. I couldn't believe that it had actually come out. I could not believe that Devo had finally released a new album after 20 years, and I was just beyond excited for this record. Of course, as I mentioned before, every time a new Devo album comes out, a big part of the anticipation is not only what the band is going to sound like, but what the band's aesthetic is going to look like. I remember when this record first came out in 2010, I thought that this particular uniform worn by the band looked a little bit cheesy, although not terrible. It was definitely not the worst look that the band has ever had, but 14 years into this album's life, you now realize that this look did not age particularly well. I did see this tour back in 2010. I saw this at the Moore Theater in Seattle. This was one of my favorite tours that I ever got a chance to see, because I began seeing Devo in 1996, and the thing about seeing Devo, most of the times that I've seen Devo over the years, with the exception of a few times, is, Devo, they come out and they give you the sort of greatest hits set list, which is nothing to sneeze at. I mean, Devo's greatest hits are as good as any band, almost any band in the world. But it was so exciting to go out and see this tour in 2010, because the band had a new look, they had the new aesthetic, and they had new songs, and they had a new sound, and this was a tour that was killer live. This band is always killer live. And for many years, I really loved this album. Not saying that I don't love it now, but for many years, I really, really loved this album. I listened to it on extremely heavy rotation, but at a certain point in time, this album began to sort of wear on me a little bit. It's still an album that I like. This album is markedly better than Smooth Noodle Maps or Something Else for Everybody. But over the years, it has sort of fallen back in their catalog as far as I'm concerned. And the one thing that sort of breaks the tie between this album and the album that I would rank just ahead of this, in a sort of negative way, is this album contains the song Cameo, which is probably my least favorite Devo song ever. That song is just the chunks, son. Now, I'm somebody that when it comes to the vocal stylings of Bob One, for me, I can only handle it in really limited doses, but especially on the song Cameo, I feel as if that song is deliberately done to annoy at least me. You might like the song Cameo. You might think I'm an idiot for placing this album at number 9 out of 11. But this album does have a lot of really awesome tracks, great songs that have still stood the test of time today. I like the song Fresh. What We Do is okay. I don't love Please Baby Please. I love the song Don't Shoot, I'm a Man. Human Rocket is awesome. Step Up is good. I mentioned Cameo. Probably the worst song that Devo has ever done. If you disagree with that statement, you and I are going to go outside, remove our shirts, and start chucking fisticuffs. Later Is Now is good. My favorite song on this album is... I'm going to go with No Place Like Home. It's one of two, but I'm going to go with No Place Like Home. It's my favorite album on Something for Everybody. A record that I still like, a record that I don't listen to as much now as I did when it came out, because, man, when this record came out, I just wore it out. And going back and seeing that tour live was the jugs, honestly. So it's not a record I dislike, but again, this is a band that's sort of working against some of the greatest music ever made when it comes to their sort of classic era. So this record, to me, it just sort of isn't their best. All right, number 8. And again, this one was very much a tie with Something for Everybody, but like I said, the song Cameo just sort of served as a tiebreaker when it came to this sort of pushing this one just slightly ahead. This record came out on May 24th, 1980, produced by the band, and that is the album Total Devo. Now, this is a record that I do still like. This is a record that, of course, it had been 4 years since the band had released their record before this, Shout, a record that is controversial among Devo fans. I would make the argument this was the first album which featured David Kendrick on drums, and as I mentioned before, that was a pretty tough hand to be dealt, in my opinion, when it came to replacing Alan Myers on drums. And if you go back and you listen to this album now, it is not necessarily the band firing on all cylinders, but I do think that this album actually has a lot of really good material on it. Now, this album, when it first came out, was just absolutely crucified by critics. This was an album that people thought the band had totally lost their way. Some people actually accused the band of trying to sell out, trying to mainstream themselves, trying to make themselves more user-friendly, more accessible than they naturally were. But, I don't know that any of that is necessarily true, but this is an album that I actually do kind of like. Now, this is not a record that I go back and listen to on the heaviest of rotation, like Smooth Noodle Maps. I would say that, if anything, this record, if it commits any sort of crime, it is that it is a little bit bland. I don't know that the band necessarily made it a conscious decision to sort of streamline their sound, but it does sound as if, they had sort of tried to take a little bit of the weirdness out of their music to try to make themselves a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit more mainstream. I don't know that it was necessarily an attempt to sell out or a contrived effort, but I think that's part of what, didn't really work for this record is, if you've ever met somebody who thinks that they're really weird and they go out of their way to try to be weird and it comes across as contrived and ingenuine, well, I think the same is true in the reverse. When somebody that is genuinely eccentric and genuinely weird tries to dumb down their weirdness, it comes across as being contrived and ingenuine, and I think that is the argument that I would make about this record. If it was a contrived idea to sort of streamline their sound a little bit, it didn't necessarily work, but, I like this album a little bit more than Something for Everybody at this point in time. I went back and listened to this record this week, a record I haven't listened to in a while. Now, I listen to this record more than I listen to Smooth Noodle Maps and Something Else for Everybody. And probably at this point in time, I even listen to this record more than Something for Everybody. But, it has some stuff on it I really like. I like the song Baby Doll. I like Disco Dancer. Some Things Never Change is okay. I do not like their version of Don't Be Cruel. The Shadow is okay. I like Agitated. Man Turned Inside Out is good. If I had to pick a favorite song off this album, it would probably be I'd Cry If You Died. It's probably my favorite song off this record. Again, this was a band, or a era of the band, I should say, that, I didn't necessarily love their aesthetic, and Jerry Casale loses a few points just based on the ponytail, which is inexcusable, son. So for me, this is a record that I think is a little bit hated by some people in the Devo fan community. I actually really like this record. A fair amount. It isn't something that I go back and listen to all the time. But for me, it's number 8 out of 11. I listened to it this past week, and I did not find it to be overly objectionable. All right, number 7. This record was released on October 8th, 1984, produced by the band. And that is the album that I think sort of represents the first sort of chink in the armor when it came to Devo. Now, this is an album that I do like. But going back and listening to everything that came out before this record, this one is a very, very visible step down in terms of quality. This record is a real line of demarcation between it and the record that came out before it, and that is the album Shout. Now, this is a record, like I said, that I don't dislike. It is a record that a lot of fans within the Devo fan community find to be controversial. This is an album that I do think has some good material on it. The thing I don't like about this album is I don't like the production, and I don't really understand where the band was going with its strategy in terms of percussion, because there's just way too much electronic drumming on this album, which never made sense to me because, in my opinion, Alan Myers is, apart from Rick Buckler from The Jam, is probably the greatest drummer in the history of the sort of punk rock umbrella. And on this record, you sort of neuter him, which leaves this album feeling slightly castrated. It feels cheap. It feels flimsy. It feels chintzy. It feels two-dimensional. Like I said, this was an album that, between the record that came out before this one and Shout, there is a real line of demarcation, at least in my opinion, between the way the band sounds. And I actually go back and I listen to Shout a fair amount. Of course, this album also features their Jimi Hendrix cover for Are You Experienced? This is a record that, if you talk to a lot of people that are fans of the band, or members of the Devo fan community, if you will, this is a record that does not necessarily sit well with most of them. I don't go back and listen to it very often. I did listen to it this past week. I thought, actually I found it to be somewhat enjoyable. This does have some stuff on it that I like for the most part. But for me, it is number 7 out of 11. I don't think it is quite as bad as some people do. I just really don't like the percussion on it. I don't like the electronic drumming. Is just something that, like I said, you have Alan Myers in your band, the human metronome. Probably, apart from Rick Buckler, the greatest punk rock drummer of all time, and you totally neuter him. Now, it's been rumored that that is what sort of alienated or Alan Myers, I should say. And of course, by the time that Total Devo came out in 1988, Alan Myers was no longer a member of the band. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. All right, number 6. Now we're starting to get into the classics. The albums leading up to this point are all good for the most part. They all have stuff on them that's really good, but now we have entered into the era of the classic Devo. This is where this ranking list, at least as far as I'm concerned, got very difficult. This one Putting this album at number 6 is difficult because this one is pretty much almost as good as everything else in the band's classic era. But for me, the weakest of the classic era Devo albums is their second one, Duty Now from the Future. This record came out on June 1st, 1979. This is an album that I love for the most part. I love the band's sonic expression on this record. I love the aesthetic presentation of this band. If there's one reason why this album ranks as far as being the bottom of the classic era of Devo's catalog, it's basically because of two songs that I just don't like, never really have, probably never really will. One being Pink Pussycat. That is a song that I just have never liked, and I really have never liked their version of Secret Agent Man. For some reason, that's just one of their songs I don't like. I don't like Working a Coal Mine either. Those are two Devo songs that kind of like bother me. But apart from that, this album, start to finish, is pretty snug. Now, one thing I don't like about this album is I don't like the production on it. It is way too quiet, especially if you're listening to it on any sort of shuffle. When the songs off this record come on, they are way too quiet. I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but most of the songs on this album are just awesome. I love the band's physical presentation. During this era, I love the Devo corporate anthem. I love this version of Clock Out, Wiggly World, Blockhead, Strange Pursuit, Triumph of the Will, Red Eye. I mean, this album is chocked full of groceries, but if I had to pick one favorite song off of this record, as generic as it probably is, it would probably be The Day My Baby Gave Me a Surprise, which is also one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Devo music video of all time. But for me, this was tough. Putting this album at number 6 was tough because this one is awesome. I go back and I listen to this record all the time. My one or two minor quibbles with this album would be those two songs I mentioned, Pink Pussycat and Secret Agent Man, and I don't like how quiet the record sounds when you put it on. All right, number 5 for me. Now we're entering into the second of two compilations that are featured on this ranking list, and that is the Hardcore Devos Volume 1 and 2. I don't think that any Devo ranking would be complete without the Hardcore Volumes 1 and 2. And these are albums that I believe I first bought the Hardcore Devo Volume 1 on CD back in the mid-1990s, right when I was first starting to get into collecting the Devo material on CD. And this was one of those albums that I was not at all familiar with this era of Devo's career until I just happened to pick up Hardcore Volume 1 one day at one of my local record stores, and immediately I recognized its brilliance. But I also immediately recognized that this music was a little bit over my head. I was not quite ready for it, so as good as I knew it was, I went ahead and I put it back on the shelf to save for a later date, and I went back and I began re-listening to New Traditionalists and Freedom of Choice and Oh No, because this was music that just I was not quite ready for. Several years later, I went back and I re-approached the hardcore era of the band's career, and it just stuck. And to me, this is still some of the greatest music that has ever been made. I mean, to me, this music isn't even cutting edge. This music still sounds as if this is from the future. I absolutely love both of the hardcore Devo albums. The first one came out in 1990. Of course, it features Mechanical Man, Auto Modown, Space Girl Blues, Social Fools, Satisfaction, Jocko Homo, Midget, Stop, Look, and Listen, Mongoloid. The second Devo Hardcore Volume 2 came out on August 23rd, 1991. Now, I definitely like Hardcore Volume 1 over Hardcore Volume 2, but Hardcore Volume 2 has Bamboo Bimbo, Be Stiff, Baby Talking Bitches, I Need a Chick, 37, Fountain of Filth. I mean, this is some of the greatest music ever made. Sometimes I think if I could only listen to one era of Devo's career, which is impossible, it might actually be the hardcore era, because to me this is some of the most interesting, unique, futuristic, gaudy, weird music I've ever heard. And I remember, like I said, the first time I started listening to this music, I didn't get it at first, but I'm sort of a dullard, you understand, but I realized its brilliance immediately. Actually, one of my favorite times seeing the band live was back in 2014, when the band took this material out on the road for the Hardcore Devo 40th anniversary tour, captured here at the Fox Theater in Oakland, California. I did a full episode on this live album earlier in the history of Archaic Records, and I was actually at this show at the Fox Theater in Oakland, California in 2014. Apart from probably the first time I ever saw Devo, this might have been my favorite show I've ever seen, because the set list was absolutely unbelievable. A lot of this material was stuff I never thought I would have an opportunity to see live, and the fact that they captured it on what is probably one of my favorite live albums of all time is just unbelievable. Of course, before this show in Oakland, or before this tour, Bob 2 had sadly passed away, and I remember for this show, at least the one in Oakland, for the encore, when the band came out and played Clock Out as the encore, Bob 2's son came out and played with the band. It was sort of a tear-jerking moment, I'm here to tell you. But for me, the Hardcore Volume 1 and Volume 2 is number 5. I mean, I feel as if you can't even aptly describe how good that music is, at least with my limited vocabulary, you understand. All right, number 4. This album came out on September 16th, 1981, produced by the band. And that is the brilliant New Traditionalist. An album that sound I love, and also the band's aesthetic for this album I am absolutely in love with. Now, it's well documented that, of course, this album was the follow-up to the hyper-successful Freedom of Choice. The band was getting pressure from their record company to go out and sort of write another Whip It, another big MTV radio hit. The band sort of went in the opposite direction. They went a little bit darker with this record, a little bit, not heavier. You can't really say that Devo were necessarily a heavy band, but definitely a little bit heavier in their content, a little bit darker. The one thing that Devo does, and I think of this as being a compliment, but it was sort of naive for a record company to, even at this early sort of stage of the band's career, it was sort of naive for the record company to expect Devo just to come out with a Freedom of Choice, the sequel after the success of Whip It and all of the accolades that Freedom of Choice enjoyed, because this is a band that just never repeats themselves. And if you go back and you look at their entire catalog, for better or worse, this is a band that's always moving forward. Starting in 1974, all the way through to today, this is a band that has never repeated themselves. They do not live in the rearview mirror. They're always moving forward. So for a record company to expect this band to just pump out another Freedom of Choice would be naive on its best day. This is an album that, start to finish, I mean, is pretty much as good as it gets. I love the song Through Being Cool, Jerking Back and Forth, Pity You, Soft Things, Going Under. I mean, there's not a bad song on this entire record. If I had to pick, if I had to pick a weakest song off this record, I don't even know if there is a weakest song on this record, honestly. As far as my favorite song off New Traditionalists, again, it's probably going to be a pretty generic choice because it's such a popular song. Apart from Whip It, it's probably the band's most popular song, I would guess, at least. That is A Beautiful World. That is just a song that I never get tired of, the song and the video. The video is one of the greatest music videos of all time, so I guess I would go with that as far as my favorite song. That's tough. That's because this album, that's tough to pick a favorite song. I guess I'll stick with Beautiful World, but picking this album at number 4 also is not a dig, mind you. It is a compliment, because this would be a pretty respectable best album for many, many artists throughout the history of rock and roll. But the fact that this is your number 4, I would take that as a compliment, not a dig, if I were you. All right. Number 3. This album was released on May 16th, 1980. It is easily the band's most popular album of all time. That is Freedom of Choice. This album is basically perfect. There really is not a bad track on this entire album. I love the sound of this record. I love the band's aesthetic. Of course, this was the band where they busted out what is probably their most familiar piece of uniformery, if you will, that being the flower pots, as most people call them, the energy domes. This is a record that is pretty much perfect. I mean, slightly, and I mean just slightly better than New Traditionalists, but this is, of course, the album that broke the band on MTV, at least in terms of their mass popularity. Now, of course, they had some success before this record came out with their first album and with Duty Now for the Future, but this was the record that burst them out onto the mainstream, if you will. Despite their sort of outsider status, the fact that this band ever became as mainstream as they did just sort of defies logic. But this album is basically perfect, start to finish. I mean, really, there's not a single bad song on this album, except for the fact that, and I realize that this is probably a very cliche opinion, but I'll just say it because this is a song that, at this point in time, it's just overplayed. I've heard it way too many times. That is, if I just never heard the song Whip It ever again, I think I would survive pretty well. That's not saying that it's a bad song, because Whip It is a good song, but if I never hear that song again, it would be all right. And that's one thing that's one sort of observation I'll make about seeing the band live as many times as I have over the years, especially if you go out and you see them do these sort of greatest hit sort of set lists that they've been sort of prone to do over the years, is for some reason when I go see Devo, this is a band that has I get to sense a lot of sort of casual people showing up at their shows now. There's a lot of diehards. Devo have a lot of diehard fans, but you occasionally get people that I think in large groups are sort of casual fans. And for some reason, when I go see Devo live, there tends to be a lot of chit-chat at Devo shows. A lot of the casual people sort of spend a lot of the show talking amongst each other, taking selfies, sort of being generally annoying until the song Whip It gets played, and of course then they start freaking out. I love this song. Yeah. Now, fortunately, at this point in time, when you go see Devo live and they have to play the song Whip It, I get the sense that this band is as tired of the song Whip It as I am, because if you go see Devo live at this point in time, they play the song Whip It at about triple tempo. You know they're just trying to get through it. And then as soon as the song Whip It is done, then the casual fans go back to sort of talking amongst themselves. I love this album. I mean, this is about as classic as it gets. Like I said, everything in the band's classic era is just the jugs. There's not really a bad song on this entire album. You can look, you can dig, you can rent a truffle snuffing hog. It's not going to do any good. There's not a bad song on this album. My favorite song on this album is Easy. That is probably my favorite Devo song of all time. which is Gates of Steel. So, for me, that one's number 3. Number 2. This album came out on October 27th, 1982. Produced by Roy Thomas Baker. Now, this one and Freedom of Choice was a tie also, basically. Very, very difficult to go back and sort of pick which one of these I liked better. But I gave the nod to Oh No, It's Devo for a sentimental reason. Now, you can make the argument that sentimentality should not sort of factor into a conversation like this, but in this case it has to, because this was the very first Devo album that I ever purchased, and I immediately fell in love with it. Now, there's a reason why this was the first Devo album I ever purchased, that being that at the time, I was living in a place called Chico, California. I was going to school and working out there, and we had this record store in downtown Chico called the Underground. And the Underground was basically the coolest place in the history of the world. At least in my early years, that was a place that if I wasn't at school and I wasn't at work, there was a 95% chance that you would find me at the Underground spending what little amount of cake that I had made flipping burgers during the week. And back in those days, I've mentioned this on this channel before, there were record store clerks that were a little bit snotty. That was part of the whole experience of going to a record store. It's something that at this point in time I actually sort of miss. As much as I found it to be irritating back in those days, it's something that I miss today, because nowadays the record collecting community is such a niche market that when you go into your local record stores, they tend to know who you are. They know your proclivities. They're very friendly. It's almost like, you're having a conversation with one of your old chums. But back in those days, it was very intimidating. I mean, some of these record store clerks, at least in my experience, and maybe this was just me, maybe I needed to get over my self-consciousness, but they would actually make you rethink things that you were going to buy, things that you might be embarrassed of. And I remember I went to my local record store, the Underground, purposely with the intent of buying my first Devo CD. And of course, this is pre-internet, so you couldn't just go on eBay and pick the one you wanted. You were sort of at the mercy of what the store had in stock. And they had 2 Devo CDs in stock that particular day. One of which was this one, Oh No, It's Devo. And the other one was this one, Freedom of Choice. And one of the people that worked at this particular record store was this girl. Now, back in those days, in the mid-1990s, we had these things we used to call alternative girls. And it just was sort of, although it's a loose definition, it was sort of self-explanatory. She was an alternative girl. And I thought that she was pretty snug, if you know what I mean. I would not have kicked her out of bed for eating crackers. But she just had this aura, this attitude, this like arrogance about her. I just found to be irresistible. And as I was sitting there, flipping back and forth between these 2 Devo CDs, which one I was going to pick up, I ended up choosing Oh No, It's Devo, because I was afraid that this girl would think if I was buying Freedom of Choice, I was only buying it for the song Whip It. So I went ahead and made this purchase, which I never regretted, by the way. This album is simply perfect. Now, I've heard people say this, and I don't disagree with this, that this album has, sonically, it isn't the most diverse album in Devo's catalog. It has sort of a consistent soundscape most of the way through it. The music videos, I would sort of heap onto that pile as well. If you go back and you watch the music videos from the Oh No, It's Devo era, it almost looks as if they were all filmed in one day. They may very well have been. I'm not actually even sure of that. But I loved this record. I loved the way it sounded. I loved the band's aesthetic. I loved the collars. I loved Mark's glasses on this record. I mean, to me, this album is just basically perfect. I don't think there's really a single piece of clunkage on this record. If I had to pick one weakest song, man, that's getting pretty loose with the language as far as I'm concerned. But if I had to pick one weakest song, it would probably be Speed Racer, which I like. I'm not saying it's a bad song. I'm just saying it's probably the weakest. Favorite song off this record is Easy. That's probably my second favorite Devo song of all time. That is Deep Sleep. For some reason, it's just always been my... Apart from Gates of Steel, which is my favorite Devo song. Pretty much always has been. Deep Sleep is my second favorite Devo song of all time. So for me, that breaks the tie. The sentimentality of Oh No, It's Devo for number 2. So that brings us to number 1. We made it, man. We made it. In a shade less than an hour. We are kicking ass today, son. Anyway, this record was released on August 28th, 1978, produced by Brian Eno. It is the band's major label debut, Are We Not Men? This album still sounds cutting edge today. This album came out in 1978, and it still sounds as if it is from the future. This is a perfect album. To me, if you could only own one Devo album, which is beyond absurd to even consider such a notion, this is the one. Of course, this is the album that introduced the world to the famous radiation suits. To me, this is probably one of the, if you consider Devo to be a punk band, which I do, especially on this album. I mean, Devo evolved a lot over the years. Ironically, get it? Devo evolved. Get it? But for this album, I think that this was a punk rock band. I think this is a punk rock album. I think that this is one of the greatest punk rock albums of all time. If you don't own this album, I honestly don't know what you're doing with your life. I don't know how you're spending your time, but you are clearly wasting it. This is as an essential an album as there is. And not to say that everything in the band's classic era isn't, but this one is the best. Of course, I love the artwork on this record. It was inspired by professional golfer Chi Rodriguez, apparently. Not that I'm overly familiar with who Chi Rodriguez is. I remember in the 80s he was like an old man who golfed. He was like on the senior golf tour circuit, whatever it is. I'm not really a big sports guy, clearly, but he used to do the sword fighting thing. There's not a bad song on this entire record. I mean, if I had to pick a favorite song, oh my god, that's tough. I mean, I don't even know if I could pick a favorite song. There's not a bad second on this entire album, so there's no point in even trying to find a weakest song. Man, that's tough. I love this entire record. Oh my god. I'll say Come Back. Oh my god. I don't know. I'll say Come Back, Johnny, I guess. Man, that's so tough. Anyway, for me, this is the greatest album in the Devo catalog from August 20th, 1978. Anyway, we made it, man. We got all the way through the 11, if you count those two compilations, 11 Devo studio albums. Now, I've done a couple Devo episodes in the past on this channel. If you are so interested, you can go back and check out my videos on the Hardcore Live in Oakland experience, and also my video on Oh No, It's Devo, which I did several months ago. All of these albums will get their own deep dives at some point in time along the way. But we made it. We got all the way through the Devo catalog. I want to thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. Check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And I guess that's going to just about do her. So until next time, my friends, talk to you then.